Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chloe Martineau, and with me is Mathieu Lebois, Flair's co-founder. Today, he'll be discussing how to leverage DRP capabilities in your cybersecurity strategy from both a broad lens and also how it pertains to financial institutions. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, to just throw them into the chat. Mathieu will get to them at some point in the conversation. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Mathieu to get us started.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chloe. So thank you everyone to be here today. I'm happy to be here with you today. Today it's more like a formal presentation of 20 minutes. I've tried to make the topic a little bit more actionable for you, so you can go out with the presentation and actually have a clear view of where to start and what to look for to get more value out of the DRP capabilities in your environment. I prefer when it's still informal. So please, if you have any question, put it in the chat. I prepared a presentation that I'll think will last between 20 and 30 minutes, depending on the interaction. And after that, I'd be available to answer any of your questions related to the slide or more generic to what we do at Flair as well. I started a presentation of thinking how I can give concrete example of how to leverage capabilities in leverage DRP capability into an existing ecosystem or an existing environment in cybersecurity. And this really like all the idea that I start to think about it, and I've worked on a presentation in that direction. So I wanted to be applicable as much as possible. I've worked in a financial institution before as a red team leader. So I've seen, I experienced the different function of cybersecurity that we will discuss today in the presentation. So for today's agenda, we'll talk of considering digital risk protection in your cybersecurity strategy. Then after we'll go into the concept of obtaining comprehensive view on your data exposure. So basically, which data that exit the environment of a company and basically where the data ends up from an external perspective. And really the core message in the presentation is how you can leverage existing internal control into an environment with in order to leverage and supplement external control as well. In that direction, we'll be looking at two use cases regarding DRP and creating DRP in other capacity of an ecosystem in cybersecurity. And finally, we'll be looking more theoretically on how how can DRP help into the risk modeling, compliance, and also in incident response. So without further ado, we'll go into digital risk. And I think the first thing to do is to explain what is digital risk protection. I need to do a little bit of a disclaimer here. I don't like the term digital risk protection. For me, digital risk is really too broad. Anything is a digital risk. But the category in cybersecurity category has been defined this way. And it's really the concept of looking from external cyber risk and really trying to understand them, measure the risk, and develop appropriate measure to protect against those external cyber risk. So I promised you that will be the only reference to Gartner in that presentation, but really I really like this graph here that is coming from Gartner because it does show that DRP is really, really broad and really encapsulated a lot of different function. And it's really the concept of looking from an external perspective to the organization and see how we perceive the organization in terms of cyber hygiene, but also identify what are the data that is floating from an outside perspective to the company that you may or maybe not be aware of and may not be related to a malicious intent. So as opposed to classic cyber threat intelligence, where we're looking a little bit more into the malicious actor ecosystem, DRP is a concept of looking at a broader scheme and say, hey, what are the employee error or mistake or shortcut that also lead to information disclosure. So we'll be talking about the concept of a digital footprint. Here, really the concept of a digital footprint encapsulated closer to the data exposure. So all the data, all the assets that are related to an organization that could be identified from an external perspective. Also in DRP, there's concept of account takeover, fraud campaign, brand protection, but really today we'll be focusing on digital footprint and data leakage detection. And really here, what we're trying to do is see how DRP, that is a new concept, a new functionality, integrate into existing proven framework. And I'm referring to the NIST cybersecurity framework because I think it's simple, generic, and really applicable to the real function of a cybersecurity day-to-day operation. And really where DRP fits in, it fits in all of the category, but really more into the identify and detect. So it complements the identify function. It assists the protect functions. So a little bit of validating if the protection help, and basically assisting you in developing the right protection in place, and to put the right protection in place based on what we've seen from an external perspective. Definitely, I think it's a no-brainer that it contributes to the detect function in order of a continuous monitoring from an outside perspective. Guide the response function by adding context on top of the detection that have been made. It will help you to do an appropriate response to an incident, and then also help in the validation process of the recovery function to really see if the issue that we did identify was completely recovered from. So a little bit more into the two functions that I identify a little bit more important in DRP is really in the identify function, and really three activities that are part of the identify function is it document information flow, maintain software inventory, identify threat, vulnerability, and assess and risk to asset. So in those three functions, really how can DRP help is identify any cloud data storage, any SaaS platform that is being used by your employee, by your consultant, by your third party, that are valid or unknown information flow, and document those information flow, and also document indirect exposure due to third party or external partner. So there is information, there's organization company, and there's organization data that is going to third party is really as well helping you to assess that. In terms of maintaining a software inventory, it's really the concept of shadow ID, undocumented entry point, undocumented and unknown data exposure. So yes, internally you have an IT asset management. Yes, you're controlling a little bit of the information, the flow of the information, but really what we want to do that is supplement that inventory by a different approach. Though instead of starting from an internal perspective and trying to identify everything that we know, we do that approach, but we also look from an outside perspective to cross-match the gap between the two and have a better view of the different assets and the different documents that are exposed publicly. Identify threat, vulnerability, and risk to asset. It's a little bit more of the classic cyber threat intelligence function that is part of DRP. So really understanding where your data is, what is in that data, is it a threat to the organization, and identifying what are the IT assets that are there that we weren't aware of, what are the vulnerability in those IT assets, and really managing the risk to those assets. In terms of the tech function, implementing security continuous monitoring capacities. So really the concept of a continuous detection from an external point of view. So instead of doing punctual assessment, it's really the idea of like looking on a continuous monitoring so you don't miss any incidents or interesting information between the assessment, that the punctual assessment that you may do. Verifying the effectiveness of a protective measure. So I think that's really the concept of validating what you have in place. Think for example, of you put in place a DLP, but we also see some sensitive document being leaked outside of the organization. So it kind of validated the technology, but also the process that could have that could be within the company. And really, the ultimate goal is really to know the expected data flow from your enterprise to the external, and also where the data flow between the external party to the organization. So that is how I see DRP fitting into the NIST framework. Really where we want to go after that is, okay, we understand where it can help, but really the first step is, what is my data exposure? Like, how can I, like, where do I start? And really, it's really started with the infrastructure mapping in terms of data leakage. So understand better the company in order to enhance the search function, identify relevant data. I think you're all aware that it's easy to flood an organization with data that may or may not be related to them from an external point of view, but it's really important to be able to understand what we know about the organization. So starting with what the organization know about it itself, and really expanding that through infrastructure mapping in order to identify undocumented IT assets, vulnerabilities on the external surface, subsidiaries, or alternative brand to the organization. So really starting what we know and discovering what we don't know. And that is really the first step in order to identify relevant data leakage and relevant indirect exposure to the organization. So the infrastructure mapping, the discovery process that we'll speak of a little bit later down the presentation, is really the core pieces in order to understand what the company is, in order to detect some relevant data leakage from there. And really thinking of data leakage, what we're thinking about is data that is related to the organization, non-malicious intent leakage, so file sharing or collaboration, usage of external SaaS by employee. And one hint that I'm giving you is there a way to look at the web proxy to understand what are the platforms that are being used by the user in order to guide the external data exposure monitoring from an external point of view? So that is kind of a different strategy that you can put in place. And for sure, looking as well as malicious intent leakage, so insider threat and data spillage resulting from cyber attack. That is the data leakage. And the last thing that needs to be considered into your external data exposure is really the indirect exposure. So a third party being targeted by ransomware that lead to disclosing a document that was related to the organization. So, for example, you're a bank, you have one of your clients that is victim of ransomware, the financial information of that client is being exposed to the ransomware attack, it will affect you as a financial institution. And really, the indirect exposure we need to think about, as well as mentioned by customer, social media, or even traditional media. So as I mentioned, acquiring the data is not the hardest part. Acquiring the right data is tough, and the hardest part is really to enrich, contextualize, and prioritize. So that's really how the concept of seeing a DRP and external monitoring should be like. So first of all, taking what we know about the organization, expanding it, then after getting some relevant information related to the expansion of the footprint that we discover, and then from there, connecting the dots and connecting the different data points in order to add context on top of it and be able to prioritize and really give, hey, this is issue number one. It's top priority for those reasons. You should look at it ASAP. And then guide to the remediation. When we think about data exposure or digital footprint, it's really the concept of looking at dark web, clear web, employee behavior, a malicious actor, and also third party. It could be targeted attack, it could be account takeover, it could be data leaks, it could be leaked PIIs, it could be malicious domain. It can go on a wide set of information that is not only associated with malicious intent, but also associated with the day-to-day usage of employee and consultant that can lead to information disclosure. And really, the goal of that infographic here is really to show that we have a ton of data, and really we need to be able to sort them in order of prioritization, not necessarily to hide information to hide information. It's really the goal is not to hide information, but it's really to correlate that and aggregate the data point together in order to prioritize the view, and then we can start from there. And I've been already mentioning the concept of like leveraging the internal information with the external control, and that's really the goal here. So internal knowledge, we can think about asset inventory, so internal or corporate domains, project and brand name, partial key or partial secret, strategic or critical third party, key people, so key executive, and also passive IUC or passive knowledge that we may be looking on a continuous monitoring just to make sure that the recover phase, validate the recover phase on the continuous matter on a longer period of time. So really the internal knowledge enrich the external monitoring, where with the external monitoring, we can identify undocumented domains and asset and undocumented data exposure due to broken process, human error, or ongoing potential incident. And with that information that we are getting from an external point of view, it's really to validate or supplement the internal capacity of a company. So you kind of see it's a feedback loop, and it needs to work this way to provide more information and more insight. So in terms of the use case, so speaking of integration and leveraging internal information with the external monitoring, is really how we can do an integration with the SOAR, how we can do an integration with the asset management or a vulnerability management platform. So those are the two use case, well, 3 use case that I will be showing today. As I mentioned, there's additional use case. We talk about DRP, we talk about web proxy. There's all kind of integration that could make sense and data that could leverage from an internal point of view in order to help help the DRP capacities. I split those into this organization because the SOAR integration is more like a one-way integration where the DRP is providing information and the SOAR actually take the decision. So it's not a feedback loop, as opposed to the IT asset management and the vulnerability management platform, where it's a bidirectional relationship and integration. So to go for the SOAR integration, what we really think here is, let's take prioritized activity from DRP, correlate those data with other cyber capacity, run, see if it matched some SOAR playbook, trigger the action, and report on the action that have been put in place. So if I give you a concrete example here, so let's take a user that uploaded a sensitive document publicly. It can be correlated with the employee directory and passive M. You may have a playbook that says, hey, if that's the second occurrence that this user is disclosing sensitive document publicly, this user just received a training that is forced, and it needs to be done by this user on, I don't know, the next 5 days. And then the user received the training, and then reporting on the success of that training and the output of that, and also reporting on the number of occurrence and the number of users that were forced to do an additional training, and SOAR have this capacity to report at a broader scheme as well within the organization of what really happened, and cross-matching what really happened with what we perceive from an external point of view. If we look as ITM, so IT asset management platform or vulnerability assessment platform integration, it's really similar use case where we take data from the external, we look from an external perspective, and then we go back internal. So IT and domain from the ITAM. So we start the discovery process based on the asset that we know already. So domains and IT inventory coming from the ITAM. We started the discovery process. We extended the footprint. We validated this extended footprint to make sure that it's really related and it's really relevant to the organization. And then after this validation and the drill down, we do the comparison of the 2 subset of the 2 data set, and then we sync the internal with the external information that we additionally find. So you can think of shadow IT, you can think of undocumented data flow. That is the type of information that can be synced back internally. And looking from vulnerability management, what we can see is basically to start with the top known vulnerability that is into the VA platform. Query external data, external public source that are aggregating all of the vulnerability into the different IP range in the internet, validating that data set that we obtain publicly with what is known by the organization, and do a cross match. Then after looking for the more important vulnerability for any evidence related to the exploitability. So we can think about a POC that is available on GitHub or any source code repository, or POC that is available on exploit.db, discussion that happened on the illicit community that related to specific organization or specific CVE, And then based on those evidence, we are able to prioritize better at the VA level the vulnerability, and then update the severity of those of those vulnerability. So really here, the takeaway is DRP will provide value if they use it as standalone capacity. You will identify relevant information. The DRP capacity will be able to correlate and make some correlation on the external data point they find. They will be able to do some kind of prioritization. But really, a better strategy, in my opinion, is leveraging DRP with your existing process and capacities. Take what you know and start at this point to expand the discovery in order to find what we don't know and have a better coverage and supplement the existing capacity. So DRP capacity can be enriched by integrating with internal knowledge and then supplement existing cybersecurity capacity. So finally, on a risk modeling and compliance incident, what I want to bring your attention on is what are some other function that can benefit from the knowledge without necessarily integrating. So it's the same concept of using different tools in order to achieve your goal, but not necessarily without a formal integration to API. If we take, for example, at the risk modeling, one challenge when we model a risk is evaluating the likelihood of a risk based on past event and past evidence. And really, this is where DRP can help. It can provide past evidence of that of incident that occurred, either at your organization level, but also at your peers. So looking at the actual organization cyber posture, but also at your peers, and trying to gauge the likelihood of a risk and of a threat that happened, and evaluate the risk of the threat. It can also assess if the efficiency of mitigation controls are in place. So let's say you have some risk, you put in place some mitigation control. It will provide on the validation, if I'm coming back to the NIST framework, on the validating the resolution, the recovery and validation. It will help you there to see if the compensating control that you put in place are efficient. In terms of compliance, external monitoring can provide validation on the efficiency of the control that are in place. So compliance, most of the compliance framework ask to do some type of monitoring. It's usually not specified that it's external monitoring or cyber threat intelligence. It's usually more as a logs and event monitoring. Usually the compliance framework will ask the organization to do some event monitoring without necessarily specifying internal, external, or other. But DRP can help there validating that the control that are in place are efficient. So if you think about the SOC 2 Type 2, it requires this type of operating effectiveness of your control that you put in place, and DRP can help you as a proof to say whatever the control was efficient or not. And finally, on the incident response, is a bit more classical use case. DRP can act as a feedback loop. So either within your incident response, you discover IUC, you discover information that you want to see if there are new occurrence or any mention of that from an external point of view. This is definitely where something DRP can help, but can also go the opposite way and look at the cyber posture of the organization, give you some hint and some insight of where to start to look as a potential entry point of and potential causes of the incident. So I think that is kind of my last slide. It's kind of summarize a little bit of different idea that you can do with DRP, and I think you understand at this point that it's not something that DRP is not something that you put standalone on his own tenant and you let it run. It's really provide more value if it's core to the strategy and core to the ecosystem in terms of cybersecurity. If it's core of the cybersecurity ecosystem of an organization. That is it for me. There is some reference in the chat regarding our DRP white paper, and also through this, an example of a SOAR integration with Microsoft Sentinel in the chat.
Thanks, Mattia. Thanks for sharing that with us. And of course, if anybody wants to continue the conversation with us, please email us at hello@flare.systems, which I'll send in the chat there. And also you can see more resources on our website. So thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody have a great day.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good day.